Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation about fracking. I'm Jason McIntyre, and I'm going to be explaining to you what fracking is, the perks of fracking. I'm going to do a deep dive and find some of those. I'm going to find the cons of fracking, and then talk about fracking in Canada, and specifically in New Brunswick. So let's start off right away with the big question. What is fracking? Fracking is hydraulic fracturing. It's a process done to obtain natural gas and oil resources in the ground below us. So this is done by drilling hundreds of meters into the ground and using large pipes to shoot materials into the ground. The process of shooting materials out, the materials combine chemicals with large amounts of water and sand at high rates of pressure to create rock formations underground, and these formations are used to fracture material surrounding oil and gas, enabling them to be extracted. So this main tube that you see here on the left side of the diagram, that's your main pipe coming down, and they'll shoot materials down, and they try to fracture it to get some gas pockets to loosen up and fly back up that tube. And before they send the gas or the oil up the tube, they separate it from the chemicals in the water underground. So more often than not, the water will stay underground, and everything else will come back up and be transported to be turned into electricity. Now, obviously, I summarized it in a minute. There's a lot more to the process than that, but for a basic introduction to what it is, that's the gist of it. You're digging underground and you're finding gas and some other goodies underneath there. So, what are the perks of fracking? Got my little thumbs up Harold here to keep me company as I try to find some positives about fracking. So first off, fracking gives access to resources that were previously unreachable. So as normal sources of gas and oil begin to run dry, many locations are still out there that can be tapped through fracking, and only through fracking, not through other means of getting oil or natural gas out of there. In fact, actually 60% of oil and gas wells operating in the United States today are fracking wells. So as other sources dry up, fracking will be there for us for the future, for a bit longer than other ways of getting it anyway. Another perk, lowers the cost of oil and natural gas. Because it floods the market with so much more oil and natural gas, there are more types of resources out there in the market, and as a result of the abundance of fracking wells, the net price of oil and natural gas have dropped substantially with the recent fracking boom. Another perk, it promotes the use of natural gas as opposed to oil. So burning shale gas and other natural gases is actually less harmful for environments than burning oil or coal. Again, fracking is still much more harmful than nuclear or other green energy sources, but compared to oil or coal, it isn't actually quite as bad. Additionally, if countries can supply themselves with... Oh, I jumped ahead. If countries can supply themselves with natural gases from their own lands, they won't have to import coal or oil from across the world. So less transportation of coal or oil, less pollutants coming out through that transportation. So the idea here is that countries can supply themselves theoretically with shale gas and resources beneath themselves that they can get through fracking. Another point, now that I've talked the other one through the ground there, comparatively less damage to air quality. To build on the last point there, burning natural gas is also comparatively a lot better for air quality than burning other resources. So strictly speaking about carbon emissions here, natural gas puts out 117 pounds of CO2 per BTU of energy created. BTU here standing for British Thermal Units. So 117 pounds of CO2 per BTU for natural gas. Comparatively, propane releases 139 pounds of CO2 per BTU, and coal releases a whopping 228 pounds of carbon per BTU. So if we're talking about carbon emissions into the environment, which speeds up climate change, shale gas, natural gases are less harmful to air than some other sources of energy. Now, let's get into the downsides. Also, it creates jobs, because people love to argue that it creates jobs. Green sources of energy also create jobs, but in my research, a lot of people said, don't get rid of fracking, we have jobs from it. So I put an exclamation mark on that one just to make them feel a bit better about that pretty weak point. All right, downsides of fracking. So earthquakes are a super common occurrence during fracking operations and after fracking operations. Before I dive into earthquakes specifically, I want to talk about one example in particular. So on February 25th, 2019, in the Chinese village of Goshan in China, there was a 4.9 magnitude earthquake which injured 12 people and left 2 of them dead. Studies concluded afterwards that the earthquake was caused by fracking nearby. So this was not the first earthquake that was ever caused by fracking, but the reason I want to talk about it right now is because this was the first recorded time that people died as a result of an earthquake that was caused by fracking. Since 2019, when this happened, there have been multiple fracking-induced earthquakes that have claimed the lives of other people, mostly in China, who have gotten very into fracking lately. So this isn't, an issue that's going to speed up other issues or cause damage to environments. It's not exclusively going to do that. It also has a much more, much more visceral and immediate consequence. These earthquakes are hurting and killing people. So, earthquakes. There is a strong link between fracking intensity and earthquake frequency. Locations that have a lot more fracking going on suffer a lot more. So how does it actually happen? How do earthquakes come as a result of fracking? It is caused by slipping faults in rocks underground, which is caused by general interference and water disposal. So when you're digging deep into the ground and when you're lodging things in there, that can mess up the plates under there and shift things around. Another huge cause of earthquakes as a result of fracking is the water disposal. When they're shooting off these water chutes and chemical deposits into the ground there, that can loosen up or cause these plates underneath our feet to shift around, which is the cause of earthquakes. Um, Now, a lot of people will say that these earthquakes are not as strong as normal earthquakes, which is true. Fracking caused earthquakes typically don't have the magnitude of natural occurring earthquakes, but it's very important to note that they also occur much closer to the surface. So the earthquake I was talking about earlier was a 4.5 earthquake, but it happened much closer to the surface than normal earthquakes would. So 4.5 sounds weaker, but when they occur so close to the surface, they can impact us a lot more than you would think a smaller, quote unquote, smaller earthquake would. All right. So looking at this image here, you may already know what this is, but if not, you might think it's I don't know, a weird metal album or something, but it's not. It is actually water pollution caused by fracking, the chemicals getting into the water. So, the biggest qualm that people typically have with fracking is the damage that it does to the water in nearby areas. Um, so, fracking contaminates underground water sources. Not only the water sources nearby, but toxins in that water can drift off and travel miles and have wide-reaching ripple effects on nearby environments. So when I'm talking about toxins here, I'm specifically talking about chemicals coming down through the fracking shafts, such as formic acid and benzol. Ultimately, this means that many people living near fracking wells see high contents of toxic materials in their drinking water, and in extreme cases, as we saw a second ago, the water actually becomes flammable. If you look at the picture here on the right, you'll see that stream of water cutting through the whole image. So they'll actually put the fracking material in the tubes through these streams of water, and there are runoffs and there are chemical spills. So the water that's traveling past the fracking sites will go on for a long time and continue to wreak havoc on environments downstream. Um, it also contaminates the soil. The water spreads into the soil, and this can make it very difficult or impossible for people to be able to successfully grow food and sustain themselves. And again, as we've seen time and time again in this class, people affected by this type of resource mining never asked for fracking to come to their community. They usually share 0% of the wealth generated by fracking. It's another example here of the autonomy and safety of communities coming second to the greed of people who wanted to mine these resources and sell them. Also, water consumption. Not only does fracking contaminate water, it also takes a lot of water to actually make a fracking operation work. Approximately 1.5 million gallons of water per fracking well. So think of how many fracking wells are in Canada alone, across the world as well. This adds up to, oh, sorry about that. This adds up to billions, billions of gallons of water being wasted through fracking. So fracking not only wastes lots of water, but it contaminates water outside of the process. Um, and when we're living in a time when water is becoming a bit of a precious resource, uh, fracking and its relationship to water just seems quite irresponsible. Let's hone in here. Let's focus in on fracking in Canada specifically. So, fracking in Canada dates back to the 1960s. Since then, it has been a slow and steady increase in popularity of fracking. So most fracking actually happens in Alberta and British Columbia, but after the 2000s, they started to pop up more in Quebec and more in New Brunswick, slowly becoming more popular. And these dots on the map here, one dot is not one fracking well, one dot is a hotspot. So each of these hotspots would have numerous wells tapping the resources underneath the ground there. Concerns grew in 2011 when popular opinion around fracking began to shift. As more information of the consequences of fracking became common knowledge, many Canadians grew opposed to the practice. After clashes with the First Nations communities that made national news, which we will dive into in a second here, and for environmental concerns as well, 4 provinces in Canada eventually decided to put in place temporary bans on fracking. So these 4 provinces were Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and New Brunswick. So, I know what you're thinking. Okay, New Brunswick put a ban on fracking, so the story has a happy ending, right? Fracking was banned in much of Canada, and we learned our lesson, and we're not going to abuse the environment or First Nations communities anymore, and everything's fine and perfect. Unfortunately, this is not the end of my presentation, because that is not the reality that we're living in. Fracking in New Brunswick has continued. Take a look at this article here, just from last year. New Brunswick Indigenous chiefs left blindsided by decision to lift fracking moratorium. So, after promising to put a moratorium or a long-term pause on fracking in 2019, the newly the conservative leadership announced a huge left turn, saying that they're actually looking into resuming fracking, specifically in Sussex. Now, this isn't just frustrating because of the disrespect of this particular example. It's upsetting because it shows that any fracking ban that is placed in Canada right now can easily and just callously be overturned with little notice and almost no consultation of anybody. So I wasn't able to find any more recent updates on this story in New Brunswick since this article here. And no fracking operations have begun as of yet, but the Conservative government has clarified here that they are seeking options to begin the practice again. So we shouldn't feel safe or secure here in our province, and we need to remain vigilant to make sure that they don't actually resume these practices once more. Alright, little interruption, I had to restart there, but we're back. Quick shout out to Screen Cap-O-Matic for forcing their watermark into this video. So yeah, continued fracking. Conservatives announced their intentions to begin fracking in Sussex early as 2021. They did not consult the First Nations, and they did not consult any environmental agencies. Pretty frustrating. So, I feel like any discussion about fracking in New Brunswick would be lacking information if it did not talk about Rexton and the now very famous Rexton protests here. So this is a key example which highlights eco-racism, a topic which we've become very familiar with in this class. But it's also an important example because it hopefully will make you very upset and will make you more alert to the fracking issue and the larger issue of how the Canadian government deals with First Nations protesters. Pretty reliably, this is how First Nations protesters are met in our country. So, Rexton. Let's talk about why the First Nations were protesting back in 2013 and then dive into the RCMP's response to their protests. So, firstly, many members of the Ellis-Potog First Nations community and other people were protesting as well at the time. They were against the expansion of shale gas extraction via fracking due to their knowledge of the impacts such resource mining already had on their environments and communities and concern for what further destruction would be caused if the government were to pursue more fracking in their area. So that's the first issue they had. The second issue, which is perhaps the more significant one, is that the land that the government was trying to use to expand fracking wasn't the government's. They didn't own it, and they had no right to contract it off to resource mining operations. So it's important to note that they always had the option to involve First Nations communities to ask for their permission or to perhaps offer up some of the profits. But instead of acknowledging their mistakes in the face of the protests, the RCMP and the Canadian government, acting through the RCMP, sought to shut down the peaceful protests. So they decided to shut down the protest, citing unsubstantiated reports that some of the First Nations members were planning on escalating the issue with violence the next day. So that's correct. They became violent to shut down the protests because they heard that the protesters were going to become violent themselves. Not great rationale there. So to shut down the protests, they began to use force and pepper spray, which made protesters turn from peaceful to enraged. Protesters launched Molotov cocktails. They torched several RCMP cars. Many protesters were struck with projectiles, such as rubber bullets. So ultimately, after hours of conflict over a couple days, 40 protesters were arrested and taken away. Amongst them was the chief of the El Espoto community. So again, these were peaceful protesters being arrested solely on the suspicion that they would eventually turn violent. So flashing forward, in 2020, the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission interviewed over 100, not in 2020, but the information came out after the events in 2013. This commission interviewed hundreds of people involved in the protest from the RCMP side and the protester side. In 2020, one of the members of this report leaked some of the findings, what the report was going to say, and apparently the report comes to the conclusion that the RCMP treatment of First Nations was completely unbiased, and that the force that was used by the RCMP was, quote, necessary and proportional to the circumstances. So again, the report is not out yet, but this is early findings about what this report contains. Now, this conclusion is completely counter to many of the experiences that were held by protesters on that day, who reported excessive force and racial slurs being thrown at them by the RCMP. So while the watchdog does report, it hasn't officially been released yet. This is a bad omen for what it's going to say. And it's just another piece on the pile of disrespect being dished out towards First Nations people in our country, and the lack of listening being done by the Canadian government, and the pursuit of profits above all else. So eventually the practices were halted. Fracking was discontinued in 2014, as I mentioned earlier, in New Brunswick. And the Rexton protest played a huge part in raising awareness on fracking issues across the country and turning popular opinion against the practice. So while Rexton was eventually free of fracking, it is just frustrating that they are still disrespected and doubted even to this day over these protests. So what can we do? What can you do, average Joe and Jane at home there? Well, first off, you should stay up to date on the Conservative government's plan to resume fracking in our province. They have told us that they are interested in doing more of it, so we need to keep up to date and voice our concerns if they pursue it further. 2, advocate for a nationwide ban on the practice. Heck, why not even international? Go past the nation. Many countries have already outlawed fracking, and hopefully more will follow suit. 3, learn the advantages of green energy to refute claims that fracking is our #1 choice. Many people still are hugely in favor of fracking, but in the opinion of many people, and myself included, it is not where we should be focusing our attention and resources. So learn the facts on green energy and tell it to people who love fracking. Conclusion. Fracking does have some advantages. I can see why it's a popular choice, and I can even understand how it's a better alternative than traditional methods of extracting oil and gases. But at the end of the day, it is still incredibly destructive to environments, and it is a pretty wasteful process, and it's just another method of obtaining non-renewable sources of energy. While there are merits to fracking in comparison to older methods of energy production, fracking is still inferior to modern, greener sources of energy. So, sure, fracking is the lesser of two evils when it comes to traditional oil digging, but it is still an evil. So we should stay on guard and work hard to ban it from our country. Thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely day. Get the frack out of here.